Hello and welcome to the Pediatric Brain Tumor Foundation's webinar, Identifying Barriers, Understanding Health Disparities, and Advocacy for Latino Families Facing Pediatric Brain Tumors. My name is Alex Henderson, and I'm the Bilingual Family Support Manager for the Pediatric Brain Tumor Foundation. Thank you for joining us today for this important subject. Before we get started, I have a few guidelines to review. You're muted for this webinar and your video is disabled, but we welcome questions during and after the opening remarks. So please type your questions into the Q&A feature found at the bottom of the Zoom window. We might not get to every question, but we'll try to answer as many as possible. And we are pleased to welcome Dr. Henry Garcia for today's webinar. Dr. Henry Garcia is a leader in the biopharmaceutical industry with over 25 years of career experience. He's launched over a dozen pharmaceutical products that treat various types of cancer, pulmonary fibrosis, and foodborne allergies in children. He's worked for prestigious multinational organizations such as Roche Genentech, Exelixis, and is currently serving as an integration officer with Nestle Health Science. Dr. Garcia holds a Master of Science degree in Quality Assurance with a concentration in Change Management, and he also holds a Doctor of Education in Organizational Change and Leadership from USC. His doctoral dissertation focused on the underrepresentation of Latino children in cancer clinical trials. Dr. Garcia resides in both the San Francisco Bay Area and also in Querétaro, Mexico, with his partner of 18 years and their 5 dogs. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Henry Garcia.
All right. Hello there. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, whether you're located in the eastern part of the country, out in the West Coast, or somewhere in between. I am so truly grateful that you are here, and I appreciate your attendance at this webinar. I also wanted to give a special thanks to the PBTF community for inviting me a second time. So here today, we're going to dive in a little bit deeper in exploring a piece of the Latino experience. So again, thank you very much for being here. I wanted to begin today by remembering and acknowledging a member of our PBTF community that we lost this year. I came to learn of Rachel's story through the eyes of her mom. And when I heard about her and all of the beautiful relics that her family shared, it was always about how Rachel was the center of the family, a light that was ever present in any room that she went into. And she is one of the many reasons of why we're here and why we do this, why we're on this lifelong mission of helping children like Rachel and her families so that they can live longer and aspire to great things. So Rachel, today's presentation and the webinar is in your honor, and we miss you. We are at the tail end of National Hispanic Heritage Month, and from mid-September to mid-October, it is an opportunity to celebrate everything Latino. And it coincides with several countries having received their independence, and they're celebrating their independence anniversaries. For us here in the United States, we take the opportunity to celebrate the diversities, all of the rich foods, the cultures that make up Latin America. We're talking about 2 hemispheres, 2 continents, over 40 countries. So you can imagine it is not a monolithic society. There's a lot of different languages spoken, hundreds of dialects. and it's just a vibrant place. We also take a look at the histories of our Latino communities, how they have immigrated to this country, and their association with the United States, whether it be before the US actually formed or after. So it's just a brilliant time to sit back and reflect on the richness and the diversity of the Latino experience. One of the things that we do as Latinos is we like to share stories, and we're storytellers by nature. So we like to pass on traditions this way. We like to pass on anecdotes that may have occurred in our family. We do this through the form of storytelling so that future generations can continue to be engaged and involved in who we are and our families. So today you're going to see snippets of these stories from a research study that I conducted in 2023. You're going to see those experiences in this presentation. So the problem of practice is something that is quite real, and approximately 300 of our Latino children die every year from experiencing a childhood cancer. And it's crazy to say that in 2025, here we are with so much advances in technology and the way that our society has progressed and greatly improved in overall childhood survival of cancer. But nonetheless, one life is too many, and 300 for sure is something that needs to be treated. Amongst all of the minorities in the United States, Latino children have the highest rate of metastatic cancer. And we are the largest growing community of the BIPOC um, denomination here in the United States. And what we mean by metastatic cancer, you are all seasoned experts and professionals, and so I know you know, but just so that we could review together, um, metastases occurs when, in essence, the cancer has spread from its original target organ to distant or nearby organs. And at that point, the options for treatment become smaller. There's time is of the essence, and so progression will continue if there is not a therapy that is available for treatment. So it's a very unfortunate period of time for the patient and the family as they start feeling like options are running out, and again, time is of the essence. So brain cancer, which is something that the PBTF focuses on, is the second most prevalent cancer in Latino children, according to the American Cancer Society. And despite that, we see these numbers, right, where it's the most prevalent in Latinos of all the BIPOC communities. It's many different forms of cancer exist and occur in the Latino community. And yet, despite that, only 2% of the total cancer population participating in clinical trials are Latino children. So when I learned of that statistic, being a professional coming from profit biopharma, I was just intrigued in how is this possible? How is it that only 2% of all of the clinical trial population, all of the people that are pursuing and possibly benefiting from these investigational new drugs and therapies, only 2% have access or are actively enrolling into these trials? What's going on? And I mean, we're talking about 2,900 cases per year. There's approximately 16,000 children that are diagnosed with cancer in this country every year. So it just doesn't make sense. The numbers aren't right. And so this was my problem of practice for my research study. And that's when I came to the PBTF to seek support and assistance in trying to explore this question. So my research study was very small, involved 10 self-identified Latino sets of parents. And really, the crux of this study, yes, while it is about the child's cancer experience and them going through the diagnosis and getting the right treatment, but the reality is this is more so about the families and what were some of their factors, what were some of their thoughts going into knowing what a clinical trial is about, making that decision as to whether or not they wanted to participate. That was really the true essence of this study, is what information was available, what were the socioeconomic conditions, and what were the sociocultural factors that influenced their decision making. We had representation from across the country, mainly from California, Arizona, and Georgia. There was a subset of the families that had a child who had some form of blood cancer, and 4 participants came directly from the PBTF community. And I'm so eternally grateful that I had the opportunity to meet these families. All 10 participants had medical insurance at the time of diagnosis, and that becomes important when we're talking about socioeconomic conditions. Just some other interesting factors. When we're looking at the Latino experience and when we're talking about the Latino community, we often look at it through the lens of acculturation. And what acculturation means in a sociological perspective is people who leave their native homeland and will travel to another place and will integrate into the dominant society. Now, the question is, do they abandon their old traditions and ways of being, or do they somehow interpolate and somehow embody both sets of traditions from their homeland as well as from dominant culture in order to assimilate and be a part of, in this case, the American experience? So for me, in this particular sample, 90% of the families felt that they were acculturated. They were first generation US Latinos. And what that means is that the child was born here and the parents came from elsewhere. And so that's a very important fact to stick to as we move through the rest of this webinar. 90% of these sets of parents felt comfortable with English, even though they weren't born here, whether they had an accent or whether they were able to fluently communicate. 90% of them felt comfortable with speaking English, which was an interesting number that we'll also get into. 50% of the families expressed dealing with a financial hardship at some point in the experience. And I don't mean to be stereotypical, but when you think about Latinos, you may associate them with the faith and with Catholicism or Christianity or Jehovah's Witnesses, whatever the case may be, because again, we're not a monolithic block, but nonetheless, Latinos are very religious. And I came in as a researcher with that bias where I assumed that families were going to prefer seeking towards God or fatalistic thoughts where we leave it up to God versus science. And I was pleasantly surprised being a scientist, and again, checking my own implicit bias at the door, was that 50% of these families were able to rationalize between faith and science just fine. There were absolutely no issues with both dichotomies living in an inclusive manner within these families. Sorry about that. Work chat's going on. So at the end of the day, 6 families chose to participate in the clinical trial, 3 chose not to, and 1 family was unsure. And we'll get to that because this lack of clarity as to whether families knew if their child was in a clinical trial or not is something that I want to dive into as we move forward. So, having said that, let me see if I can get this camera out of the way. All right. So, having said that, the first research question that we looked at was this concept of information resources and gaps. So, some of the things that come to mind is obviously a valuable source of information and resources are the medical and educational professionals themselves. Doctors, school officials, high school counselors, you name it. But this body of professionals can be a very, very valuable source of information for the families as they are debating whether or not to go through a clinical trial experience. And in fact, there's a quote here where this one family felt that their oncologist, they attributed that person towards being an angel. So there's again that strong connection of divinity with science. And I thought that was absolutely fascinating. At the same time, this same concept where these professionals can be a valuable source of information, but they can also create a gap of information in the parent's mind. In this particular instance, what we see is that school officials took over in this family's diagnosis or at the stage where there was a diagnosis happening and determined that there was a behavioral problem with the child and that they were depressed to the point of being suicidal, and that's why they were retracted from society. They didn't want to go to school. They were drinking a copious amount of water, and with tears in her eyes, this mother shared how she allowed the school officials to kind of take over in her child's experience. Unfortunately, that child was misdiagnosed. And we know that when talking about metastatic cancer and this type of disease profile, again, time is racing. We need to be able to match a correct diagnosis with a viable treatment option plan for these children so that we can move forward away from a metastatic disease profile. Now, one would also assume that the more information sources available here in the United States, the better off families will be. But we know for all of us out there that follow news and get our information from various sources, we live in a very polarized society right now. And so, depending on where you get this information from, depending on if you analyze that information, do you vet it? Do you question it? Are you skeptical? Do you look for a variety of information sources to help form and shape your opinion? Well, in this particular case, these families would turn to the internet, but if they weren't searching in the right place or if they were finding confusing statements, that would lead to a phenomena called the epidemiological paradox, where studies show that actually first generation and second generation Latinos have lower overall childhood survival rates from metastatic cancer when compared to native born or recently immigrated families. And is it that they're getting overloaded with information? Is it that they're getting confused in some way? And as you see from this particular family member at the bottom, her understanding of clinical trial was she thought that the word experimental and going through that process meant that the children were getting special treatment and access to the oncologist, but not necessarily that they were being treated with a drug that wasn't yet approved. That's absolutely astounding when you think about it. But I would be interested to hear from you in the chat. Has this been your experience with families that you've engaged with and provided support and service for? Have you seen the same thing where there's a sense of confusion, where there are misdiagnosis events happening? In this particular small study, there were 6 out of the 10 families had experienced an original misdiagnosis that led to a waste of time. So I would be interested in comparing that with your particular experience, and we'll go over that at the end of the presentation. The second cluster is looking at socioeconomic factors, and here one would think about the financial aspect, and yes, that's true. But there's also this cluster of need for resources, and that's where you come in. Nonprofit organizations, social workers, translators. There's a variety and a plethora of resources out there. But what this study showed was that depending in the region of the country where you are, depending on your economic mobility and where you are from a financial perspective, these resources may vary, and you may not have a consistent availability of such resources. I'd be interested to hear from you if you find that to be true. Of course, the second topic is that of financial assistance. We found that families, 5 of them experienced a financial hardship. 3 of the families had to have one parent permanently quit their job so that they could tend to their loved one. And a lot of families, 4 of them, 4 of the 10, relied on charities and donations in order to survive. The third element that I wanted to focus on are the communication barriers. And this was something that was very prevalent for this particular study, where we're talking about 90% of the families feel comfortable with English, but yet 6 of those families asked to have a translator participate in the experience, whether it was to convey symptoms that the child was feeling, or vice versa, to be able to receive messages from the doctor and the medical profession with regards to diagnosis or with treatment of action, what was going to be the plan. And so 4 of the 6 families asked for translators. And check that out, the bottom quote that said from this parent, "The translators at the hospital were not good. Sometimes I could tell that they didn't understand the doctor's terminology." Imagine that experience. If the resources that you are relying on to get care for your child, and you could sense that they're incorrect and that they're not correctly conveying what's happening, this could be a center of a big source of mistrust that can develop between the community and the folks that are providing the service professionals that are providing support and service. It was absolutely astounding when I interviewed these families and learned that it was so prevalent. This happened in 2/3 of the cases where families asked to have interpreters present. Another interesting thing was in this cluster of communication barriers was to think about the different styles of communication that we have. In Latin America, there's a concept called respeto. And what that means is that you defer to a person of authority. You don't question, especially if they hold a medical degree and they went through so many years of schooling and training. It's just not typical for a Latino to raise questions or to second guess that person's level of authority. And so, something that was interesting is that in this particular case, for this sample set, 7 of the 10 families felt they needed to be anti respeto. They needed to be insistent and to demand answers. And so here's a quote from a family member that said, "And at my insistence, I recall that the doctor said, 'We will perform these tests only because you keep on insisting.'" That is anti-Latino. That's not the typical Latino. And so, was it a first generation thing? Was it that families are getting accustomed to the American experience quickly and did it out of a mode of desperation? I'd be interested to hear if you've seen that in your practice and in your daily life. This last part is around sociocultural factors. And again, we've been talking about the US acculturated Latino. And so, what this means is that these families have left their homeland and are adopting a new way of life, either for survival or because they want to get ahead or because they truly just want to be a part of the American experience. And so, some of the elements that came out from the interviews were these concepts of trust, la familia, fatalism, altruism, and sympathy. These are common traits and common factors amongst Latinos that, despite, let me see if I can get the camera out. Despite having traveled so far and now being a part of the American experience, um, these elements still resonate for Latinos. And what we found was that 6 out of the 10 families developed a mistrust along the way, along the process. And in this particular case, LZ is saying, "How am I going to trust the doctors if they are relying on computers? It is here where I lost confidence in their ability." So it's again contextually understanding where the Latino is coming from and that they see people of authority with scholastic training. And maybe it could be explaining that they're utilizing their training along with information sources, just like the families are doing, to try to build action plan is all that's required in order to restore that trust and confidence between the doctor and the family. And um, another thing that I wanted to mention was in La Familia, 5 of the 10 families luckily had help and were able to rely on their families who were in close proximity. But we need to remember that oftentimes not all of the extended family is here in the United States. They might be off in the homeland, brothers, sisters, aunties, uncles, grandparents. They just might not simply be here. And so for 5 out of the 10 families, that was exactly the case. And this one family said here, as Latinos who come from other countries, it's hard when we do not have our families here. Just think about that. Uh, and lastly, this concept of sympathy. There were 4 out of the 10 families who expressed that mothers ended up building connections with other mothers who were located at the cancer centers. They gravitated towards each other. And I feel like that is an amazing opportunity if for us who are focused on as service providers and as people on this mission to keep that in mind when considering the Latino family. So, to wrap up, key findings. There was a lack of trust that developed somewhere along the way, whether it be from original misdiagnoses, incorrect translations, implicit biases that families had for their caregiver or for their doctor, whatever the case may be, somewhere along the way, there was a lack of trust that developed. This lack of trust led to families needing to validate information across multiple sources, and mothers sought sympathy from other mothers to express fatalistic thoughts and as a coping mechanism for them to survive together. So, I was asked to provide strategies as part of this webinar, and this is where I'm really going to turn to you as the professional that works in this space. Every strategy that I put forward to obtain my doctoral degree was from a textbook research-oriented perspective. So I needed to couch that because I'd love to hear from you if you feel that this is even feasible or that it's possible. So let's explore that together. The first strategy was based on certifying Spanish translators. Let's put our resources out there towards helping professionals learn how to understand complex medical terminology, how to have crucial conversations, and to discuss sensitive topics with family members. Let's go through a formalized training, and this is already happening in various states, including here in California, where state dollars, go to providing standardized training and certification for people to become official Spanish translators. So I thought that that would be an idea. Secondly, let's create a triadic team that's doctor-led and that involves you guys, involves nonprofit organizations and social workers to push out information, to get on the same page and have alignment with regards to deployment of resources. How can we best reach these families and avoid confusion? So there were a few examples of where this has been happening. The family-centered rounds model includes now translators that go to bedsides and communicate with the parents and the child directly in the hospital setting where the room is, where the bed is at, and where they are receiving infusion, to really make sure that communication is streamlined and crystal clear. And lastly, this concept of mothers supporting mothers. I'd be interested to see if you think that this is a Latino thing, or if you feel that mothers in general gravitate towards other mothers. But there was quite a number of families where mother took over, mother was the leader representing the family, engaging with the medical professional, understanding the complexity of the clinical trial process. So why not train these mothers to become emerging leaders and to be able to provide support to other mothers? In Latin culture, we call this the promotoras model, and it's been quite successful here in California. And there's some references there of where it's been prevalent and research articles for you to look up. So we've reached the end of the presentation, and I just wanted to describe, I already mentioned one of the biases that I had coming into this research study, but I want to share the rest with you because it's coming from a very biased perspective. I'm not a social worker. I am not a public health official. I come from for-profit biopharma. And my job is to, as the head of clinical trial quality with Nestle Health Science, is I review all of that documentation that is going to go to the potential subject. We review informed consent forms. We make sure that we're providing all of the risks and all of the potential benefits to the potential subject. We go through inclusion criteria, exclusion criteria, so that they don't feel like they're being ostracized or removed from a clinical trial because of the way they look or where they come from. So I do this for a living, and that's why I feel like it's my mission to make sure that we're providing transparent information to these vulnerable subjects that just want to get a second shot. So as I mentioned, I am Latino, born and raised in San Francisco, a dual citizen of the United States and of Mexico. I call the US home, but eventually I'd like to retire to Mexico and see if I could bring more of these strategies and solutions to communities outside of the US, all around the world, because we definitely need the support. And my why will always be my dad. This is why I do this. He passed away from colorectal cancer. He was diagnosed with stage 4 terminal disease with only 3 to 4 months to live. It was actually 3 to 6 months back in 2005. He had a goal that he wanted to watch his son graduate from high school. And so I helped him through that experience. Being familiar with biopharma and wanting for him to see my little brother graduate, I got him enrolled in a clinical trial and it helped him live longer. And so I feel like that is my why. So I wanted to share that information with you as you look at the context of this study and you think about how it's impacted you and what you could do for your community and what you've thought overall in general about today's session. I thank you so very, very much for being here. I also thank you for sitting through my work chats. And I very much look forward to answering your questions. Stay connected with me. I'm on LinkedIn. My email address is there. And with that, I'll stop sharing and turn it over to you, Alex.
Yeah, that was awesome. Thank you, Henry. So some of the questions that we got from um, registration, how can pharma do better than just translating materials into Spanish?
Ah, that's so good. That's a really, really good question. So oftentimes it's working with clinical research organizations or firms that, in essence, help you manage a clinical trial. And oftentimes we go to these CROs, to these parties, and they have very powerful databases. If you think about AI, that's where it's going, where now we know population centers in every city. We know in close proximity to where these families are living. We know a lot of information about them. And so we turn to the CROs to help us when we're looking for a certain population or a certain group of folks that are experiencing a type of condition. We will work with CROs to make sure that we're reaching out to as many of the target audience as possible, because we want to get these therapies in the hands of people that are in vulnerable communities. And so that's one of the ways that we actively do that. That was a great, great question.
Cool. And what barriers exist that are unique to the Latino community versus other people of color?
Ah, another great, great question. I think the study, although it's just a slice, because it's a very small sample set, but you look at the intensity of respondents in that sample, and then you multiply it by the population. That's how you start to form trends. And something that I thought was very unique to the Latino community was this concept of English being your second language. You feel comfortable speaking English. You're in such close proximity to your native country and the United States. Um, and yet, there's so much of a wide gap between what they're trying to say and what's being told or what's being communicated to both the doctor and to the patient. I found that to be very interesting. And I'm actually curious if other minorities have felt that way. But I thought that that was something that opened my eye. Also, this concept of religiosity, because Latinos overwhelmingly in Mexico alone, which is the country that I could speak of, we're talking about 85% Roman Catholicism. So, I mean, these are 85% of the country is a devout Catholic. And so I was just, because I've heard it growing up in church and attending Mass, it's like you believe in God, God is the ultimate power, the ultimate decision maker. And I was so pleasantly surprised to see that these acculturated families are saying, well, actually, you can have both. You can have the power of science, and God makes these medical professionals and puts all of this knowledge into their brain so that they can help us. I thought that that was fascinating and unique to the Latino experience. Great question.
I think this question came in when you were talking about misdiagnosis. I think sometimes families can interpret a more detailed diagnosis, like genetic traits, COG, clarifying pathology, with a misdiagnosis of the original preliminary diagnosis. How did you define misdiagnosis in your
Mm,
study?
mm. From a very simple qualitative perspective, so in essence, a family were told that it was something, and they went on a treatment plan or a course of action, only to find out that whatever symptoms were not going away. They then returned to the hospital, either to that same place or to another location, and received a totally different diagnosis that was then ultimately the correct one. We had situations where it wasn't just a behavioral condition where they were diagnosed. In some cases, there was a family from the PBTF community where they thought that there was something wrong with their spine, and they were experiencing severe arthritis. And there was a series of therapies and medications that were provided to the family, and the child wasn't getting better. Eventually, the child ended up crawling and crawled into the emergency room, and that's where doctors felt like, okay, this is not arthritis, this is something else. And again, at the insistence of the parents, had these other tests performed. And yeah, is there better ways to get from test to diagnosis? Can we improve that? I'm sure medical professionals out there are working on that every day, but it's something that was definitely prevalent in this study. Great, great question. Um, I'm just kind of looking at the chat and reflecting, Alex. Misdiagnosis, I don't see that much. I do see some difficulty understanding what's involved with participating in a trial. Absolutely. I totally hear you, Barbara. I've definitely seen misdiagnosis, Allison. Um, any other questions that you may have, Alex, as I'm reading through these chats? This is amazing.
Yeah, I'm reading some of the questions from the chat. This one's from Katie. Given how hard it is to trust doctors and nurses and those from different cultures, how do you suggest nonprofits bridge that gap? And the current political climate has also made it hard to build trust.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And there's a variety of reasons why mistrust occurs, right? We saw that if they are feeling like the translations are incorrect, or if a family is feeling like there's an implicit bias that's happening between the doctor and the family, if there's an assumption that's happening, all of these are potential sources of mistrust. Um, so that's why we can't tackle and solve the world's problem in its entirety, because it's so complex. But that's why we're offering a small slice of it. And I feel that nonprofit organizations and social workers, the types of strategies that I recommended in terms of promoting a standardized program for translators, um, coordinating with doctors and social workers and nonprofit advocates to create an accountability mechanism to the doctor to make sure that they are deploying consistent pockets of information. These are all things that I think are reasonable to do. And I feel, and correct me if I'm wrong, but they actually might be getting done. But mistrust can definitely come from, at a macro level, what we're experiencing from a political scenario. You're absolutely right. There's a sense of fear in the Latino community right now, regardless of what side you're on or where your political spectrum or faith lies. It's happening regardless, and I'm agnostic either way. But what I'm saying is that, definitely that could be a source of mistrust, is because of the history of the Latino experience, what we've been through as a culture and as a people, that's definitely part of it. So very complex question, but I really appreciated it. Yeah, a lot of great. As a social worker, I love connecting our Latino mothers to each other. So many of them don't have extended family and they become each other's extended family here. Exactly, Laura. It's been very beneficial for so many of our families. This is great. Um, so powerful and important. Thank you. Thank you so much. Jan, as a social worker, I'm very concerned about our undocumented parents, sometimes patients who are living in fear of ICE. Do you have any advice to those of us trying to care for our pediatric patients whose families are coping with these issues? I know, right? Especially because when I did the research study in 2023 and 24, it's been happening. You know, this concept of deportation, and it's been going on in Democratic presidencies, Republican presidencies, so that's not it. This has definitely been happening. It's just that the way in which it's getting propaganded and displayed out in the media and in the context of where we're at right now through social channels is it's definitely getting exploited, and there definitely is a sense of fear that's happening in the community. And again, I think it goes back to trust. I think it goes back to forming those pockets of trust, reaching families where they are, whether it be in their local churches, whether it be at the time of diagnosis. Just when you meet the family and they're for the first time at the hospital and they're receiving this unfortunate news, it's trying to just know in the back of your mind, which I know you do, is that trust is essential. And how you tap into them by having your certified translator there, by being able to contextually understand where they're coming from, and the fact that there is a fear possibly there. That just goes such a long way. You know, there was a quote that I didn't read, and I have it here on one of my cards, where this family was saying that all they could have asked for to build that trust with their social worker was just an expression of empathy that would have gone a long way towards they appreciating and respecting all of the service that was being provided. But what they were really looking for is, does somebody relate to what I'm feeling? And can someone, you know, even if they haven't been through it personally, but can they just be empathetic? It goes a long way. So as a Spanish-speaking social worker on the team, my witness translators not translate well. At least I am there and I can interrupt to clarify. Thank you, Barbara, for being there. Thank you all for being there, and thank you for being here for us. It's truly appreciated. Is HIPAA a concern? Yes. HIPAA is definitely a concern, Odali, because we want to protect PHIs, so patients' health information. And going through that, even for this particular research study, there were definitely HIPAA concerns. And so in this particular case, the promotoras have that outlined as part of their model in going through training, where they deal with HIPAA training and making sure that they can comply with regulations, because that definitely is a very prominent concern for us who are trying to provide care. I find consistency also helps to create trust. When you say you are going to do something, do it. Sometimes Latino families have been disappointed by lack of follow through. Amazing. Amazing. What an active and vibrant scene. Alex told me that this was going to happen and that we were going to get a lot of awesome responses, and just your sense of engagement. I appreciate it so much, and I'm so thankful that you are here. All right, Alex, I think I'll turn it back over to you.
Sweet. Yeah, so I just want to thank all of you for being here.
Oh, let me flash up the. I'll share again. Sorry.
And obviously, Henry, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. We always really appreciate any professional in the field taking the time out of their super busy schedule to teach us, whether we're social workers or in nonprofits or families. We always appreciate when you guys take time out of your busy schedules to help us learn more about these really important subjects. And um, yeah, I also want to thank our attendees for your participation and thoughtful questions. And yeah, we'll be sending you a link to the recording of the webinar as well as the slides from today's presentation. And at the end of the slides, there is a survey, so we would love to hear from you guys. We base what our webinars are on off of the responses that we get from the surveys. So that helps guide us in the right direction. Um, and yeah, so expect that email today. And again, thank you so much, Henry. And um, yeah, have a good rest of your day, everybody.
Thank you all. Thank you for participating. Take care.